The third of the parries is the beat parry. So, how do we execute the beat parry? Well, the first thing we need to do is, unlike the previous two where we were transitioning into a specific guard, here it's a little bit more fluid. And we're executing a specific type of cut rather than moving to a specific guard. So what you have to do is you need to cut a mezzana into the flat of their oncoming sword. What this is going to do is that this cut will impact their flat and it will knock their sword away, thus creating an opening and a tempo for you to act. Fiore tells us multiple times that this action can be done against a cut, a thrust, or a thrown weapon. He also shows us that it can be done from above or below, from the right side or the left side, and when done from the below, it can be done with the true edge or the false edge. Right? This is the most information that we get, the most variation that we get on any of his parries. Fiore loves the beat. I'm convinced it is absolutely his favorite way to interact with your opponent's weapon, and that's why we see it countless times throughout his entire system, regardless of what weapon you're using. So, since we are cutting a specific cut, let's see what Fiore has to say about the mezzana. So, he says, "We are the colpi mezzani, which go crossing. From the knee and above we go wasting, and rebat the thrust out of line, and redoubling the blow, wounding is our deal, and if we encounter a fendente with such blows, we waste people." Another quote, "We go crosswise through the middle of the path of both the downward blows and the rising blows, and we strike with the true edge of the sword from the right and the false edge of the sword from the left, and our path can be anywhere from knee to the head." So we get some interesting information here in the description of this blow, right? We are told that it's good against the thrust. We know generally what to do after it, right? He's telling us that redoubling the blow is how we want to act. He also tells us that if we encounter the fendente, right, if someone throws a fendente at us, this is the action to make. We will waste them, right? There's, in classic Fiore bravado, he's like, this play will absolutely destroy someone who's throwing a fendente at you. You know, the other information we're getting is they go through, they can be used to counter downward blows and rising blows. He also gives us this interesting discussion on where they come from, right? He says that we strike with the true edge from the right and the false edge from the left. But we also see him, this isn't the only time Fiore contradicts himself, we see him show us this blow coming from both true edge and false edge from the left. Now, is that a problem? I don't really think so. Right, Fiore is not giving us the entirety of the art in this small discussion, but he's giving us guidelines on how to generally use them. And for the most part, when we see it coming from the left, it is done with the false edge. Other tips that he gives us about this beat parry. This is some critically important information here. Right? Keep firmly in your mind that thrusts and strikes from the left side should be beaten aside to your outside line, beating them diagonally upwards, not vertically. And the downward strikes should similarly be beaten to the outside, lifting your opponent's sword a little as you do so. And be advised that this guard will work against all attacks, both from the right and the left sides, and against anyone, whether right-handed or left-handed. Right, we're getting this description from the rising beat parry that he gives us in the sword and horse section, and you can really see here how much Fiore believes in this play. He's like, this guard will work against all attacks. It doesn't matter who's doing them, it doesn't matter where they're coming from, but this parry is the best. He also gives us a description of how to physically do it, right? He normally doesn't get into this level of description from a mechanic standpoint of exactly how to do it. But we see here that when we're making this beat, it has to go upwards and outwards, but not vertically, right? That's some critical information here, and it's why we're looking and treating this action as a mezzana as opposed to a satani, which we know is a much steeper and rising action, right? So it's not a vertical blow, it's an upwards and outwards blow because it has to go to your outside line. So this is a great section, a little like juicy nugget of information that Fiore gives us on how to do this action. So let's talk about the beat parry, where we can do it from, right? So we can do the beat parry from any guard that can initiate a cut. So that's an important distinction because it basically means that we can do it from any guard except Langa, realistically, right? Some guards are going to be harder than others. If you're in Kodalanga with your sword on the right all the way behind you, that's going to be a little difficult. Obviously, we know Kodalanga on the left, otherwise known as the sworded one-hand guard, is exclusively using this action. So we can see a little bit of that body asymmetry sidedness coming out here. But if you can throw a cut from the guard, you can execute the beat parry from that guard. We also know that it can be done from above or below. We also know that it can be done from the right side or the left side. We know this because he shows the beat parry coming from all of those 4 quadrants. He also reiterates that to us in sections like the sword on horse, where he shows us the Dana on the left and Kodalanga on the left, and he says that both of these guards can do exactly the same thing, thus telling us again that you can do it from above, even though most of the time he's showing it from below. We also know that when it's from below, it can be done with the true edge or the false edge, because he explicitly shows us that you can do it with both. Right, so here are some of the guards that we know can execute the parry, right? Right Dana, left Dana, Chingale, and Kodalanga on the left. So what is our follow-up action after executing the beat parry? Well, because we can do it from above and below, and those actions are pretty different, we'll look at them separately and kind of see what the patterns are, right? So, first we'll talk about from below, because it is clearly the preference that Fiore has, and I say that based on the number of times that he shows it in the text, which is quite a few. So, after beating aside their cut from below, we're told to cut back down at them along the same line. Now, this is the first instruction we get, and the most common action that we see as the response from the beat from below. A couple things to keep in mind here. It's important that you cut back down along the same line and you don't change sides. So if you're starting in your lower left and you beat to your upper right, what you want to do is you want to cut from upper right back down to lower left. So you're cutting that same line. The reason you don't want to swap, which can mechanically feel very good, is that if you're at the top and you rotate and cut a reverso, it is actually significantly easier for your opponent to turn their wrist and parry your incoming blow. Now, if they make that wrist turn, you can see in the picture here, the guy who's receiving the cut. If he tries to make that wrist turn and push to the outside with his sword, it's not going to do enough because you're already behind his sword. You're going to hit his head before he's going to be able to get you offline, most likely, right? Whereas if you were cutting the reverso, it actually takes very little to cover it unless you are just faster than your opponent. And if you're just faster, then the technique is not really nearly as important because you can just win by speed. So that's the cut. What is the next thing he tells us to do? He tells us that we can thrust, and he shows us that we can thrust with or without the half sword. This is important because, as we've talked about before, bodies are asymmetrical. And throughout his text, Fiore generally does not show us with our arms crossed and the sword extended. So what this means is that if we are thrusting on our right side, right, if we're in right fenestra, we actually would transition into half sword. Whereas if we're in left fenestra, our arms are not crossed and we can thrust from without the half sword. Now, from a modern HEMA context, if you are able to thrust with your arms crossed, that's totally fine, right? There's no rule stating you can't do it, but what we generally see from Fiore is transitioning into the half sword when you're thrusting on your right side. Finally, he tells us that you can move into a stretto play. This is relatively common, especially if as you do your beat, you are stepping in and your opponent steps in. You can get to a point where you have closed enough where you can get your hand on their hilt or the strong of their blade, or if you're really close, deep into their arms. You know, any of the wrestling plays that we've talked about in the past. So here's an example, right? Here we can see the beat from below with the cut. He's cutting back down into the head. Here we can see an example of the thrust with the spear, right? Our fencer has used his giavarina, the winged spear, to beat aside the lance, and then has thrust our opponent in the face. And finally, on the right, we can see the stretto play where we have beaten their sword aside and then grabbed the hilt with our offhand. And we will move to any of the other plays that we want to from there. So, what about from above? Is it the same? Is it different? Well, when we look at the order of the wording of how things are described, we can see that it is similar but slightly different. Right? So when beating aside from above, he tells us that we want to thrust first. Right? The thrust is the primary action from above. This makes sense because we are already extending our arms as we're coming down and beating into their sword. So the thrust is the natural follow-up action, right? We've dropped our hands from high to low. So if we wanted to cut again, we have to bring our hands either all the way down or all the way back up, which wastes a tempo. But because we've brought them down and into the middle, we can simply put the point in. So we can thrust, as we talked about before, with or without half sword, however you like. The next follow-up is that we can cut across on the opposite line. The reason that this is the opposite line as opposed to previously where we were cutting along the same line is because as you beat when you're coming down, you want to move your sword into the position where it is hardest to parry, right? So in the sense that we can see here, our fencer has beat from their high right to their middle left. The sword is going off to the left. If he was to raise his sword to the right side again and travel along the same line, again, the defense, all they have to do is turn their wrist out and they can parry it. As opposed to if he makes a V shape and moves to his left and then cuts a reverso, he's behind his opponent's sword, making it easier to land that cut. Finally, we're also told that if we're really close, we can close into any sort of stretto action that we wanted to do. So as we talked about, right, in the previous one, here we see with the thrust as the follow-up action, we also have the cut on the left and the stretto on the right, both of which you can see are taken from the play on horseback. So what about other sources, right? Is this beat parry present in the other sources? Well, like always, we go to our boy Talhofer. Talhofer absolutely has the beat parry. You can see it in multiple places. Here we can see him executing it from horseback, just like Fiore was doing. The only difference is that Talhofer's executing it descending with the false edge, which is very common throughout many of the various German traditions, throwing the descending false edge cut. It can definitely help with the beating aside, but with that wrist rotation and kind of locking out your opponent's sword. We also see it in the Lichtenauer tradition, right? Generally called the Schielhau. You make this wrist rotation, beat their sword out of the way, and put the point in. Other sources that have this, once you get into the Bolognese are very into the beat parry. It shows up throughout all of the Bolognese writing systems. This art specifically is taken from Marazzo, so we're well into the 1500s. Same with Agrippa as we start to transition into a more thrust-focused system. We see the beat parry start to go away. Most later rapier texts discuss the beat parry, but is not used as one of their primary tools of gaining measure, right? Agrippa is kind of probably the last one who uses it as a main style of engagement, where he likes to beat, especially from the outside. There's no camera.